"Don't let that black doctor touch my husband." The scream ripped through operating room 12 at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, louder than the steady chorus of heart monitors and ventilators that had filled the room only a second before. Every gloved hand froze. Every eye turned. Dr. Marcus Elijah Brooks stood motionless beneath the bright surgical lights, his steady gaze lifting from the patient to the terrified woman standing just beyond the operating room doors, her face pale with panic, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please," she cried, pointing directly at him. "Find someone else. I don't want him operating on my husband." For one impossible moment, time itself seemed to hesitate. The donor heart rested inside its sterile preservation container, only a few feet away, surrounded by crushed ice and monitored every second by the transplant coordinator. 12 minutes. That was all the viable time they had left, before the organ would begin losing its chance to save a life. The room had spent hours preparing for this exact moment. Nurses had completed every checklist twice. The anesthesia team had stabilized the patient. Surgical instruments reflected the white overhead lights like polished silver mirrors. Everything had unfolded with precision until fear walked through the door wearing expensive shoes and carrying dangerous assumptions. "Mrs. Whitmore," one nurse whispered carefully, "this is not the time." But Victoria Whitmore barely heard her. Behind her stood Richard Whitmore, his tailored navy suit wrinkled from rushing through the hospital corridors, along with two members of the hospital board who had arrived after an emergency phone call from the family. Their expressions carried uncertainty rather than confidence, yet no one stepped forward to stop the confrontation. Marcus slowly removed his hands from above the patient's chest without breaking sterile protocol. His calm voice contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said evenly, "your husband is ready for transplantation. Every minute matters now." "No," she answered, shaking her head. "I said you're not touching him." Silence spread across the operating room like a shadow. One resident glanced nervously at the countdown clock mounted high on the wall. 11 minutes and 23 seconds. The transplant coordinator swallowed hard before speaking. "Dr. Brooks is our lead cardiac transplant surgeon." Victoria's voice hardened. "I don't care what title he has." No one answered immediately. The only sound came from the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor and the quiet hiss of oxygen flowing through the ventilator. Marcus looked toward the patient lying peacefully beneath the surgical drapes. Ethan Whitmore, 43 years old, father of two daughters, had waited almost 14 months for a compatible donor heart. Tonight had been his only chance. Marcus knew every page of Ethan's medical file by memory. He knew the weakened left ventricle. He knew the repeated hospital admissions. He knew the promise he had quietly made to himself before scrubbing in, that he would do everything medicine allowed to give this man another birthday. None of those facts seemed to matter anymore. Hospital security arrived outside the operating room, uncertain why they had been called into the transplant wing. One board member, Harold Bennett, cleared his throat awkwardly before looking toward Marcus. "Dr. Brooks, perhaps we should pause the procedure until this concern is resolved." A young scrub nurse stared at him in disbelief. "Pause," she whispered. "We can't pause a donor heart." Marcus never raised his voice. "Mr. Bennett," he replied, "if another surgeon replaces me now, valuable time will be lost. This isn't about me. This is about your patient." Before Bennett could respond, another figure entered the hallway. Charles Whitfield, newly appointed chairman of the hospital board, walked briskly toward the operating suite after being called from an executive meeting upstairs. He had never met Marcus Brooks before. He looked first at the frightened family, then at the operating room staff standing in frozen silence, unaware that within the next few minutes one decision would force everyone inside Johns Hopkins Hospital to confront a truth none of them could have imagined. Charles Whitfield stopped just outside the operating room entrance, his sharp gray eyes moving from the anxious Whitmore family to the silent surgical team waiting behind the glass. He had accepted the position as chairman of the hospital board only 3 weeks earlier, inheriting one of the most respected medical institutions in the country. Although he had reviewed budgets, expansion plans, and research proposals, he had not yet learned the names of every physician leading its specialized departments. Tonight was supposed to be another fundraising dinner across town. Instead, he found himself standing in the middle of a crisis measured not in dollars but in seconds. "Someone tell me exactly what is happening," he said firmly. Harold Bennett stepped forward first. "The family is requesting another surgeon." Charles frowned. "Why?" Bennett hesitated just long enough for the answer to become painfully obvious. Victoria Whitmore crossed her arms. "Because I do not trust him with my husband's life." Charles looked through the glass toward Marcus. The surgeon remained perfectly still, his hands folded in front of him, his expression calm despite every eye in the room resting on him. There was no anger on his face, no attempt to defend himself. Only the quiet focus of someone who understood that every passing moment belonged to the patient, not to anyone else's emotions. "Doctor," Charles called through the partially open door, "is another qualified surgeon available?" Marcus answered immediately. "Yes, sir. Dr. Daniel Foster is in the building." One resident lowered his head. Everyone in the transplant program knew Dr. Foster was talented, but he had never independently completed a heart transplant this complex. Marcus continued before anyone else could speak. "If Dr. Foster takes over, he will need time to scrub in again, review every imaging study, confirm every surgical measurement, and re-establish the operating flow. We have less than 11 minutes before the donor heart begins losing optimal viability." Charles glanced toward the transplant coordinator. "Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir," she answered quietly. "Every minute increases the risk." Victoria shook her head. "I understand the risks, but this is my husband. I have the right to choose." Richard Whitmore placed a hand on her shoulder. "We are asking for another doctor. That is all." The request sounded simple, almost reasonable, until the countdown clock on the wall displayed 10 minutes and 18 seconds. Inside the operating room, no one moved. The circulating nurse stared at Marcus with pleading eyes, hoping he would somehow convince them. Instead, he surprised everyone. "If replacing me is the family's final decision," Marcus said softly, "I will cooperate. But I ask only one thing. Please do not waste another second arguing. Make your decision now so Dr. Foster has every possible chance to save Mr. Whitmore." The words settled heavily over the hallway. One young surgical resident whispered to another, "He is still thinking about the patient." The other nodded silently. Charles noticed the exchange but remained focused on the family. Hospital policy granted patients and their legal representatives significant authority over medical decisions whenever possible. The situation was becoming more complicated with every heartbeat. Finally, Charles spoke. "Authorize the transfer." A quiet gasp escaped from one of the nurses. Harold Bennett immediately contacted Dr. Foster through the hospital paging system. Marcus slowly stepped away from the operating table. The scrub nurse carefully removed his sterile gown and gloves, while trying to avoid looking into his eyes. "I am sorry, Dr. Brooks," she whispered. Marcus offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Take care of the patient." As he walked toward the exit, several members of the surgical staff instinctively stepped aside, creating a narrow path through the room. No one celebrated the decision. No one looked relieved. They simply watched one of the calmest physicians they had ever worked beside leave without protest. Outside the operating suite, Marcus removed his surgical cap and glanced once at the electronic countdown above the donor heart preservation station. 9 minutes and 36 seconds remained. He quietly folded the cap in his hands, took one slow breath, and turned toward the observation hallway, carrying with him not wounded pride, but the growing fear that precious time was slipping away from the one person who needed it most. Dr. Daniel Foster rushed through the scrub room with controlled urgency, every movement precise but noticeably faster than usual. Water streamed over his hands while the surgical nurse helped secure his sterile gown. He had assisted in dozens of heart transplants during his career, but tonight was different. He was stepping into an operation that another surgeon had already prepared from beginning to end. He looked through the small glass window toward the operating room and saw the donor heart resting inside its preservation container. The digital timer continued counting downward. 8 minutes and 49 seconds remained. Foster closed his eyes for a brief second before entering the room. "Give me the latest status," he said. The anesthesiologist answered immediately. "Blood pressure is stable. Oxygen levels are holding. We are ready whenever you are." Foster nodded while scanning the monitors. "Dr. Brooks completed the surgical preparation?" "Every step," the circulating nurse replied. "He anticipated everything." Foster looked around the room, noticing how unusually quiet everyone had become. No casual conversations, No routine confirmations. Only restrained concern hidden behind professional discipline. Outside the operating suite, Marcus Brooks remained standing beside the observation window. He did not pace the hallway or argue with administrators. Instead, he quietly watched the medical team through the thick glass, following each movement with experienced eyes. Beside him stood Emily Carter, the transplant coordinator who had worked with Marcus for nearly 11 years. She lowered her voice. "Dr. Brooks, this should never have happened." Marcus kept his eyes on the operating room. "This is not about me, Emily. It should have been your surgery," he answered gently. "Right now, it belongs to whoever can finish it. I only care that Ethan Whitmore goes home to his daughters." Emily felt her throat tighten. She had seen Marcus comfort grieving families, celebrate successful recoveries, and stay overnight after impossible cases simply because he refused to leave a patient alone. Never once had she heard him speak bitterly about anyone. Across the hallway, Charles Whitfield watched Marcus from a distance. Something about the surgeon unsettled him. He had expected frustration, disappointment, perhaps even anger after being removed from such an important operation. Instead, Marcus carried himself with remarkable composure, almost as though protecting everyone else from additional pressure. Charles quietly asked Harold Bennett, "How long has Dr. Brooks been here?" Bennett checked his tablet. "Almost 14 years. He leads the Advanced Cardiac Transplant Program." Charles raised an eyebrow. "I thought Foster was the program director." "No, sir. Dr. Foster is associate director." Charles looked back through the window, suddenly realizing how little he actually knew about the physician he had just authorized to remove. Inside the operating room, Foster carefully reviewed the surgical field. Marcus's preparation was flawless. Every instrument rested exactly where it should. Every suture had been arranged in perfect order. The donor heart had been preserved with extraordinary attention to detail. Foster quietly murmured, almost to himself, "Beautiful work." The scrub nurse heard him. "Dr. Brooks always says preparation saves lives before surgery even begins." Foster nodded without looking up. "He is right." The countdown clock displayed 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Foster inhaled deeply before speaking. "We proceed." At that exact moment, another nurse hurried down the hallway carrying a hospital phone. "Mr. Whitfield," she called, slightly out of breath. "There is an urgent call from the National Medical Credential Registry. They said it concerns Dr. Marcus Brooks and requested immediate confirmation of his identity." Charles accepted the phone with mild confusion. "The National Medical Credential Registry?" "Yes, sir. They insisted it could not wait." Marcus slowly turned his head toward the conversation, saying nothing. Charles pressed the phone to his ear. "This is Charles Whitfield." A calm voice answered from Washington. "District of Columbia. Mr. Whitfield, thank you for responding. We are attempting to verify that Dr. Marcus Elijah Brooks is currently practicing at Johns Hopkins Hospital because an important federal record connected to his medical credentials has just been activated." Charles frowned, completely unaware that within the next few minutes, the quiet surgeon standing only a few yards away would become the center of a revelation powerful enough to silence an entire hospital. Charles Whitfield listened in silence as the voice from Washington continued speaking with calm precision. "Sir, this verification was triggered because Dr. Marcus Elijah Brooks has been listed as the primary physician for a federal medical recognition update. Before we release the record, we must confirm his current hospital privileges." Charles glanced instinctively toward Marcus, who remained standing beside the observation window with quiet dignity, watching the operating room instead of the conversation unfolding around him. "Yes," Charles replied cautiously. "Dr. Brooks is on staff here." "Thank you," the official answered. "Please remain available. Additional documentation is being transmitted to your secure administrative portal now." The line disconnected. Charles lowered the phone slowly, uncertain why a federal agency would contact the hospital in the middle of an active transplant. Before he could gather his thoughts, another alarm sounded inside the operating room. Dr. Daniel Foster looked toward the perfusion team. "Give me another status update." The perfusionist answered immediately. "Everything remains stable, but we are approaching our time limit." Foster nodded while carefully reviewing Marcus's surgical preparation once more. Every measurement had already been calculated. Every instrument had been positioned exactly where it needed to be. It was as though Marcus had anticipated every challenge before it could appear. Foster quietly said, "Dr. Brooks left us the best possible conditions. We cannot waste them." Outside, Emily Carter folded her arms tightly. "Dr. Brooks," she asked softly, "why did you not tell them who you were?" Marcus looked at her with gentle surprise. "I already told them who I was." "No," Emily replied. "I mean everything you have accomplished." Marcus gave a faint smile. "Patients deserve surgeons who focus on their hearts, not their resumes." Emily looked away, unable to hide her emotion. She had heard similar words from him countless times during late-night emergency surgeries, but today they carried a different weight. Nearby, Victoria Whitmore remained convinced she had protected her husband. She whispered to Richard, "Everything will be fine now." Richard nodded, although his confidence sounded forced when he answered, "Dr. Foster has an excellent reputation." Neither of them noticed that several experienced nurses avoided making eye contact. They all understood how unusual it was to replace the lead transplant surgeon after the operation had already begun. One veteran surgical nurse quietly approached Charles. "Sir, may I speak with you?" Charles stepped aside. "What is it?" "I have worked in this hospital for 28 years, she said carefully. "I have assisted nearly every transplant surgeon we have ever had." Charles waited. "Dr. Brooks has the highest success rate I have ever seen." Charles frowned. "Why has no one mentioned that?" The nurse hesitated before answering. "Because he never talks about himself." Those words lingered in Charles's mind just as his tablet emitted a secure notification. The administrative portal displayed a flashing message, marked Federal Credential Verification. Harold Bennett leaned closer. "It is the file from Washington." Charles opened the encrypted document. The first page appeared almost ordinary, displaying Marcus's medical license, specialty certifications, and current hospital appointment. Then another page loaded automatically. At the top appeared a gold federal seal above bold lettering that immediately caught Charles's attention. National Distinguished Medical Service Record. Charles blinked once before scrolling farther. Additional pages continued downloading one after another, each containing awards, citations, photographs, and official commendations far beyond anything he had expected. Harold quietly whispered, "There has to be some mistake." Charles did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the growing file, as another secure attachment appeared labeled Presidential Medical Recognition Archive. Around them, the hallway seemed strangely silent, except for the distant rhythm of heart monitors echoing through the operating suite. Marcus still stood alone near the observation window, completely unaware that the digital record opening only a few yards away was about to reveal a lifetime of extraordinary service that almost no one inside the hospital had ever taken the time to discover. Charles Whitfield stared at the federal file, as each page continued loading across his tablet. The first commendation came from the United States Department of Health and Human Services. The second recognized groundbreaking work in advanced cardiac reconstruction. The third listed Marcus Brooks as a lead instructor for some of the nation's most demanding transplant training programs. Charles slowly scrolled farther, unable to reconcile the extraordinary record on the screen with the quiet surgeon standing alone in the hallway. Harold Bennett leaned closer. "I have served on this board for almost 15 years, he whispered. "How did none of us know this?" Before Charles could answer, another notification appeared. Attached video archive available. He tapped the file, but before it could open, the operating room doors swung outward, and Dr. Daniel Foster stepped into the hallway for only a moment. His surgical mask remained in place, but the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, keeping his voice calm, "I need to ask one question." Charles immediately looked up. "Go ahead." Foster hesitated. "Did Dr. Brooks already complete all of the donor heart measurements himself?" Emily Carter answered before anyone else could. "Yes. Every measurement. Every compatibility calculation. Every contingency plan." Foster nodded slowly. "I thought so." Charles frowned. "Is there a problem?" Foster chose his words carefully. "No emergency. We are still moving forward. But I have never seen surgical preparation this thorough. Every possible adjustment has already been anticipated. It is saving valuable time." His eyes briefly met Marcus's across the hallway. He left nothing unfinished. Marcus simply nodded once. Good. Stay focused on Ethan. Foster disappeared back inside the operating room without another word. Victoria Whitmore folded her arms more tightly. She could sense the mood shifting around her, even though no one directly challenged her decision. Richard quietly asked, "Is everything still all right?" Emily answered honestly, "The team is doing everything they can." She did not add what everyone already understood. Every passing minute made precision even more important. Through the observation window, Marcus watched the operation continue with complete concentration. He noticed Foster make a small adjustment to an instrument tray, exactly where Marcus himself would have reached for it. A faint expression of relief crossed his face. He respected Foster. He wanted him to succeed. Beside the observation glass, one young resident approached Marcus nervously. "Dr. Brooks?" Marcus turned with a gentle smile. "Yes?" The resident swallowed. "I just wanted to thank you." Marcus looked surprised. "For what?" "You taught our class that the patient always comes before our pride." "I did not fully understand that lesson until tonight." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on the resident's shoulder. "Remember it when someone else's life depends on your decisions." The young physician nodded quietly before returning to the operating suite. At that same moment, Charles finally opened the federal video archive. Grainy footage filled the screen. A rescue helicopter rested on a rain-soaked landing area surrounded by emergency responders. A younger Marcus Brooks stepped from the aircraft wearing flight medical gear instead of a white physician's coat. He immediately began directing emergency treatment with calm authority, while several injured survivors were escorted toward waiting ambulances. The recording carried an official caption beneath the image: "Federal Emergency Response Mission, Presidential Transport Support Unit." Charles stared without blinking. Harold whispered, "That cannot be him." Charles zoomed in on the image. There was no doubt. Even years younger, the face was unmistakable. Another document automatically opened beneath the video: Patient Survival Report. One name appeared near the top of the page: Charles Whitfield. His breathing slowed. He looked up from the screen toward Marcus, who remained focused entirely on the operating room instead of the growing crowd gathering behind Charles. For the first time that evening, the chairman felt something heavier than uncertainty. He felt the unmistakable weight of realizing that the man they had quietly pushed aside had already spent a lifetime saving strangers without ever asking who they were. Charles Whitfield remained frozen as the Federal Archive continued revealing page after page of Marcus Brooks's career. National recognition for medical innovation, commendations from military medical response teams, letters of appreciation from hospitals across the country. Then another document appeared, carrying the official seal of the Executive Office of the President. Charles opened it with trembling hands. At the center of the page was a photograph of Marcus standing inside the East Room of the White House, accepting the Presidential Medal for Medical Excellence after leading a team that had pioneered a life-saving cardiac reconstruction technique now taught throughout the United States. Harold Bennett slowly removed his glasses. "My goodness," he whispered. "We removed the very surgeon who helped write the standards we expect everyone else to follow." Charles could not speak. His memory drifted back to the rescue footage he had just watched. Rain. Helicopter blades turning above the landing zone. A younger physician kneeling beside injured survivors with absolute composure, while everyone else struggled to keep pace. He opened another attached report. This time it included the names of those treated during the emergency response. His own name appeared first. Beside it, one sentence stood alone: lead physician recommending immediate cardiac stabilization. Dr. Marcus Elijah Brooks. Charles closed his eyes. More than a decade earlier, he had awakened in a hospital bed with only fragments of memory after that terrifying accident. He had spent years thanking the flight crew and emergency responders, never learning the identity of the physician whose decisions had preserved his life. That physician had been standing only a few yards away all evening, treated like a stranger. Across the hallway, Marcus remained focused on the operating room. Through the observation glass, he quietly followed every movement inside. Dr. Daniel Foster continued working with complete concentration, relying heavily on the meticulous preparation Marcus had completed before leaving the operating suite. Emily Carter stepped beside Marcus once again. Dr. Brooks, she said softly. They know now. Marcus looked at her with quiet curiosity. Know what? Emily glanced toward Charles before answering. Who you really are. Marcus gave a small, almost puzzled smile. Emily, I have always been exactly who I am. She lowered her eyes, realizing how naturally those words came from him. His identity had never depended on awards, photographs, or titles. It had always been reflected in the patients he served. A soft afternoon light filtered through the large windows overlooking Baltimore Harbor, painting long, golden reflections across the polished hospital floor. The tension that had filled the hallway earlier seemed to pause beneath that warm light. Nurses spoke more quietly. Conversations faded. Even the distant sounds of rolling equipment seemed gentler than before. Charles slowly walked toward Marcus, each step heavier than the last. When he finally stopped beside him, neither man spoke immediately. They simply looked through the observation window together as the surgical team continued fighting to give Ethan Whitmore another chance at life. After several silent moments, Charles asked quietly, "Were you the physician who treated me after the helicopter crash near Annapolis?" Marcus thought for a second before answering. There were several patients that day. Charles nodded. One of them was me. Marcus searched his memory, then offered a warm, humble smile. I am grateful you recovered. There was no trace of resentment in his voice, no reminder of what had happened only minutes earlier. Charles found that almost impossible to understand. After everything that happened tonight, he said carefully, "You are still worried about my recovery from years ago?" Marcus looked back toward the operating room. Every patient deserves the same care, Mr. Whitfield. Time changes names and faces. It does not change the responsibility. Charles felt his throat tighten as those simple words settled over the quiet hallway. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he understood that the greatest measure of a physician was not found in medals, federal records, or public recognition. It was found in the quiet decision to keep choosing compassion, even after compassion had not been returned. Inside operating room 12, the atmosphere shifted from tense uncertainty to determined concentration. Dr. Daniel Foster studied the monitors one more time before quietly speaking to his team. Everything we need is here because Dr. Brooks prepared for every possibility. Stay with the plan. The scrub nurse nodded immediately. Yes, doctor. Every member of the transplant team now understood that they were standing on the foundation Marcus had built long before the first incision of the procedure. Outside the operating room, Charles Whitfield remained beside Marcus, unable to look away from the man he had misjudged only minutes earlier. Harold Bennett walked over carrying the tablet that still displayed the federal records. Mr. Whitfield, he said quietly, there is more. Charles accepted it again. Another attachment had finished downloading. It contained a national ranking published by the American Board of Cardiothoracic Surgery. Marcus Elijah Brooks had led the country's cardiac transplant outcomes for 6 consecutive years. Another page listed more than 1,000 successful, complex heart procedures. Another recognized the surgical technique known throughout teaching hospitals as the Brooks Reconstruction Protocol, a method now used by transplant centers from Boston to San Diego. Charles slowly looked up. Dr. Brooks, he asked almost in disbelief, this protocol, it is yours? Marcus answered with the same humility that had marked every conversation that evening. It belongs to every physician who has improved it while helping patients. Harold shook his head softly. You created something that is saving lives across America, and you never told anyone here. Marcus smiled gently. The patients already know whether it works. That has always been enough for me. Nearby, several nurses had quietly gathered after hearing fragments of the conversation. One whispered, I trained with surgeons from 3 different states. They all studied the Brooks protocol. Another answered, I never realized Dr. Brooks was the Brooks they talked about. Even Dr. Foster heard the conversation through the partially opened operating room door during a brief exchange with the circulating nurse. He paused only for a second before returning his attention to Ethan Whitmore. Keep moving, he said calmly. The best way we honor Dr. Brooks is by giving this patient the outcome he prepared us to achieve. The words spread quietly through the room, strengthening everyone's focus. Across the hallway, Victoria Whitmore finally noticed the expressions surrounding her had changed completely. Confusion replaced certainty. Respect replaced hesitation. She looked toward Charles. "What is happening?" Charles took a slow breath before answering. "Mrs. Whitmore, the surgeon you refused is one of the most accomplished cardiac specialists in the United States." She frowned. "No one told us that." Emily Carter answered gently. "His office walls are filled with photographs from grateful families instead of framed awards. Most people never realize who he is unless they ask." Victoria looked at Marcus for the first time without fear or suspicion. She saw not an intimidating figure, but a calm physician, standing alone with his attention fixed entirely on her husband's operation. Richard Whitmore lowered his voice. "Dr. Brooks." Marcus turned politely. Richard struggled to find the words. "You still want my wife and me to have the best outcome after everything that happened?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Your husband is fighting for another chance to watch his daughters grow up. That is the only outcome I have wanted since I first opened his medical chart." The hallway fell completely silent. No one spoke. No one shifted their feet. Even the constant activity of the transplant wing seemed to pause around those simple words. Charles felt the weight of the entire evening settle on his shoulders. Authority had given him the power to make a decision, but character had revealed who truly deserved respect. Looking at Marcus Brooks, he finally understood that greatness rarely announced itself. Sometimes it stood quietly in a hospital hallway, carrying decades of extraordinary achievement with humility so complete that others mistook it for ordinary, until the truth became impossible to ignore. The soft rhythm of the heart monitors continued behind the operating room doors as every member of the transplant team focused on the final stages of the procedure. Dr. Daniel Foster worked with unwavering concentration, occasionally glancing toward the neatly organized instruments Marcus Brooks had prepared before stepping away. Each carefully planned detail continued guiding the operation, almost as though Marcus were still standing beside them. Outside the operating suite, Charles Whitfield slowly turned to face the Whitmore family. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that neither Richard nor Victoria had heard before. "There is something both of you deserve to know," he said. "Dr. Brooks is not simply one of our surgeons. He is one of the physicians who has helped shape modern cardiac transplantation in this country." Victoria lowered her eyes. The confidence that had driven her earlier decision had disappeared, replaced by quiet regret. "I judged him before I knew anything about him," she whispered. Richard nodded silently. "So did I." Charles looked toward Marcus, who remained focused on the operating room instead of the conversation unfolding behind him. "Dr. Brooks," Charles said, taking a slow step forward, "I owe you an apology." Marcus turned politely. Charles continued without hesitation. "I accepted a decision without asking the questions I should have asked. I failed to recognize your experience, your character, and your service. More importantly, I failed to stand for the principles this hospital claims to represent." The hallway became completely still. Nurses, residents, and administrators quietly listened as the chairman of the board continued speaking. "I cannot change what happened tonight," Charles said, "but I can acknowledge that I was wrong." Marcus met his eyes with the same calm expression he had carried all evening. "Mr. Whitfield," he answered gently, "the most important thing now is that Ethan receives the best possible care." Charles shook his head softly. Most people would still be thinking about the insult. Marcus smiled with quiet warmth. "Most people are not waiting for someone they promised to help." Emily Carter felt tears gathering in her eyes. She had watched Marcus respond to disappointment with grace many times before. But tonight, everyone else was seeing the man she had always known. At that moment, the operating room doors opened briefly as Dr. Foster stepped into the hallway. His surgical cap remained in place, but relief had begun replacing the earlier tension in his face. "Everything is progressing well," he announced. A quiet breath seemed to pass through everyone standing nearby. Foster walked directly toward Marcus. "Dr. Brooks," he said sincerely, "your preparation made every critical step possible. I have never inherited a case that was planned with such extraordinary care." "Thank you," Marcus nodded respectfully. "You did the work, Daniel." Foster smiled. "No, we both know the truth." He extended his hand without hesitation. Marcus accepted it, and the two surgeons shared a firm handshake built on mutual respect rather than pride. Several members of the surgical staff quietly applauded before stopping themselves, remembering they were still standing in one of the busiest transplant centers in the nation. Victoria slowly approached Marcus, her hands trembling slightly. "Dr. Brooks," she said, struggling to hold back emotion, "I cannot take back what I said. I let fear become prejudice, and prejudice became my decision. I am deeply sorry." Marcus looked at her kindly. "Mrs. Whitmore, every family facing surgery is afraid. Fear can cloud our judgment. What matters now is what we choose after the fear passes." She wiped away a tear. "Can you forgive me?" Marcus answered without the slightest pause. Forgiveness is much lighter to carry than resentment. Richard quietly placed his hand on his wife's shoulder, grateful for words that offered healing instead of humiliation. Charles looked around the hallway at the physicians, nurses, residents, and administrators who had witnessed everything unfold. He realized that the greatest lesson taught inside Johns Hopkins Hospital that evening had not come from a lecture hall or a medical journal. It had come from one surgeon whose quiet compassion proved stronger than recognition, stronger than authority, and far stronger than the assumptions that had almost kept others from seeing the remarkable human being standing before them. 1 year later, the morning sunlight poured through the towering glass windows of Johns Hopkins Hospital, filling the cardiac wing with a warm golden glow that reflected across the polished floors. Nurses greeted one another as the first patients arrived for appointments. Residents hurried toward morning rounds carrying notebooks instead of uncertainty, and the quiet rhythm of another ordinary day reminded everyone that healing was built one life at a time. Near the entrance of the renovated transplant center, a small gathering had formed around a newly unveiled bronze plaque. It did not celebrate wealth, influence, or political power. It simply read, "The Dr. Marcus Elijah Brooks Center for Advanced Cardiac Care." Beneath the name was a single sentence chosen by the hospital staff themselves. "Compassion is the first step toward healing." Charles Whitfield stood silently near the back of the crowd, refusing the invitation to stand at the podium. He believed someone else deserved every word spoken that morning. Emily Carter smiled as she watched young physicians stop to read the inscription before beginning their shifts. Many of them had entered medical school because they had studied techniques developed by Marcus Brooks. Now they would learn something even more valuable by working beside him. Inside one of the consultation rooms, Marcus sat across from Ethan Whitmore, who looked healthier than anyone could have imagined a year earlier. Color had returned to his face. His breathing was steady, and a photograph of his wife and 2 daughters rested on the table beside him. Ethan smiled warmly. "Dr. Brooks, my youngest daughter has a soccer tournament next weekend. Last year I thought I would never see another one." Marcus returned the smile. "I hope she scores the winning goal." Ethan laughed softly. "She already says she will." Before leaving the room, Ethan paused. "There is something I have wanted to tell you. Victoria told me everything that happened before my surgery." Marcus remained quiet. Ethan continued, "You chose kindness when you had every reason not to. My family will never forget that." Marcus gently shook his head. "Then remember something more important. Use the extra time you have been given to love your family well. That is thanks enough." Ethan nodded with grateful eyes before walking into the hallway, where Victoria and Richard waited for him. As soon as they saw Marcus, both approached with genuine smiles that carried none of the fear or prejudice from a year before. Victoria said softly, "Our daughters still pray for you every night." Marcus answered, "Tell them to spend that energy praying for someone who needs it even more." Richard chuckled, "You always find a way to make the conversation about someone else." Marcus smiled. "That usually means we are talking about the right things." Across the hall, Charles finally stepped forward. "Dr. Brooks," he said, "there is one last item of business." Marcus raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. Charles handed him a simple envelope instead of a formal document. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for teaching this hospital that excellence without humility is incomplete. But humility joined with compassion can change lives forever." There was no signature beyond Charles Whitfield. Marcus folded the note carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket. "I will keep this," he said. Charles replied, "I hope you do." As the morning continued, Marcus walked down the familiar hallway carrying nothing except a patient chart and a quiet sense of purpose. Staff members greeted him with sincere respect. but he never slowed his pace or sought attention. He stopped briefly to encourage a nervous medical student, thanked a custodian polishing the floor, and held the elevator door for an elderly visitor who smiled with appreciation. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the American flag above the hospital entrance, while sunlight shimmered across Baltimore Harbor in the distance. The world had not become perfect. People would still make mistakes. Fear would still challenge compassion. Assumptions would still tempt good people to overlook extraordinary hearts. Yet every life Marcus Brooks touched became quiet proof that true strength was never measured by the authority someone held or the recognition they received. It was measured by the choice to answer prejudice with dignity, to answer hatred with grace, and to keep saving lives even when no one was watching. As the elevator doors closed and carried him toward another patient waiting upstairs, the hallway grew still again, leaving behind only the gentle echo of footsteps and the peaceful silence of justice finally finding its place.